Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the deep, incredibly diverse history of the United States to figure out what actually makes up the American identity. You know, we usually start the clock at 1776, or maybe 1607, right? But to truly grasp the complex tapestry of who we are right now, we've got to hit rewind and go much, much further back.
So, what defines an American? It's a huge question. To answer it, we're going to do something a little bit unconventional today. We'll kick things off by looking at some really brilliant modern sociological research to set our baseline. Then, we're traveling back tens of thousands of years to see exactly how we got here. Here is our agenda for today. First up, defining American identity. Then, we'll look at the first inhabitants, explore complex indigenous civilizations, touch on our Pacific and Caribbean roots, and wrap up with early European colonization. Let's get into it. Section 1. Defining American Identity. All right, so researcher Deborah J. Schuldkraut actually put the multiple traditions theory to the test. She basically wanted to know, does our growing ethnic diversity fundamentally change our national identity? In other words, does a multicultural America create a multi-creedal society, a society defined not by one single rule, but by a whole broad range of shared foundational norms? Well, her conclusion is absolutely fascinating. Her research actually confirms this multiple traditions perspective. It turns out being American literally cannot be boiled down to one neat, simple concept. Instead, there's this deeply complex and honestly, sometimes contradictory set of norms that define us. It is a wonderfully multi-layered identity. And the really crucial takeaway here is that this complex, multi-creedal identity, it's actually a unifying factor. Schuldkraut's data shows that the vast majority of Americans, totally regardless of their specific ethnic or immigrant backgrounds, actually share this complex view of the norms that make up our identity. But to understand why we are so incredibly layered today, we've got to understand the history of the land itself. Which brings us to Section 2, the first inhabitants. The timeline of this land goes back so much further than most people realize. We're talking up to 30,000 years ago, during the Ice Age, when Paleoindians first migrated from Eurasia across the Beringia land bridge into present-day Alaska. By 10,000 BCE, they were fully established across the continent, and over time, they transitioned from hunting massive Ice Age megafauna to agriculture, even growing corn down in the southwest by 3000 BCE. That's a massive span of time. Now, these early inhabitants absolutely didn't stay as one homogeneous group. They branched out into hundreds of distinct, thriving societies. Two of the earliest ones we have hard archaeological evidence for are the Clovis and Folsom cultures. We can actually identify them by their highly crafted, totally unique stone spear points. This early footprint is a perfect example of their incredible diversity and adaptation. Moving on to Section 3, complex indigenous civilizations. When we compare these early societies, the level of diversity and advancement is just mind-blowing. Around 600 BCE, you had the Adena constructing these massive earthwork mounds. They were followed by the Hopewell, who literally engineered a staggering trade network stretching all the way from the southeast up to Lake Ontario. Meanwhile, over in the southwest, the Anasazi were building massive, multi-story stone and adobe pueblos directly into sheer cliff faces. Just incredible engineering. Okay. I really want you to let this number sink in for a second. 20,000. That massive number is the estimated peak population of Cahokia back in the 12th century. Cahokia was this highly advanced Mississippian city located near modern-day St. Louis. At its absolute height, this indigenous metropolis was actually larger than London was at the exact same time. The whole urban center was built around Monk's Mound, which was this breathtaking 100-foot-tall earthwork. Just a massive scale. Further north, in what we now call upstate New York, political sophistication was reaching incredible heights too. Right around the mid-15th century, the Iroquois formed a deeply powerful confederacy. This was a complex political union made up of 5 distinct tribes: the Oneida, Mohawk, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. They were represented by a governing council of 50 sachem chiefs. It was a brilliantly organized system that allowed them to expand their territory and heavily influence the entire geopolitical landscape of the region. And you know, this history is definitely not just in the past. Today, there are 575 federally recognized tribes in the United States. These tribes are the direct, living descendants of the highly diverse, ancient, and complex civilizations we've just been talking about. This profound indigenous heritage is an absolutely foundational layer of the American identity.
All right, Section 4, Pacific and Caribbean Roots. Because the story doesn't end on the mainland. Out in the Pacific, a completely distinct civilization was taking shape. Ancient Hawaii was likely first settled somewhere between 940 and 1130 CE, with Tahitian explorers showing up later around 1200 CE. What's truly fascinating here is that this complex society developed in deep isolation from the rest of the globe for about 600 years, before they were eventually unified into the powerful Hawaiian kingdom by Kamehameha I.
Meanwhile, down in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico boasts a human history spanning at least 4,000 years. We see successive migrations, starting with the Ortoiroid culture, followed by the Arawak arriving from South America around 1000 CE. Over the centuries, they evolved into the highly complex Taino society, reaching a massive population of up to 60,000 people right before European contact.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, Early European Colonization. Now, while the Spanish and the British are definitely the most famous for their colonization efforts, the absolute earliest recorded European mention of America actually comes from Norse explorers. Yep, around 1075, a medieval chronicler referred to Norse settlements in a land they called Vinland. This basically proves European contact happened centuries before Columbus even set sail.
But of course, it was the wider European colonization starting in the late 15th century that triggered the Columbian Exchange. This was a massive, unprecedented biological and cultural swap. Europeans brought over horses, cattle, and hogs, and they exported American crops like maize, potatoes, and tobacco right back to Europe. But we have to talk about the darkest, most impactful part of this exchange: disease. Europeans brought Eurasian diseases like smallpox and measles. And because Native Americans had absolutely no immunity to these new pathogens, it triggered devastating large-scale epidemics that tragically decimated indigenous populations across the entire hemisphere. This exchange, as chaotic as it was, paved the way for the colonial footprint we are much more familiar with today. In 1607, English settlers established Jamestown. Then, in 1620, the Mayflower Pilgrims landed at Plymouth. And by 1664, the British swooped in and took over the Dutch colony of New Netherland, famously renaming it New York. This rapid, permanent establishment really laid the direct groundwork for the original 13 colonies.
But it's so important to remember the early colonial map wasn't just British. It was deeply fractured and heavily contested. Spanish influence completely dominated the South, the Southwest, and the Caribbean, where they encountered the Taino and imposed the encomienda system, which was a notoriously harsh forced labor structure. At the same time, the Dutch had established New Netherland right in the mid-Atlantic, which acted like a physical wall blocking British expansion for decades. The continent was essentially a chaotic collision of expanding empires, diverse cultures, and established native populations.
So, bringing this all the way back to the sociological research we kicked off with, when you look at this monumental history, 30,000 years of migration, the rise of massive indigenous empires, isolated island kingdoms, and the chaotic collision of global colonial powers, it perfectly explains Schildkraut's data, doesn't it? It leaves us with a pretty profound question to ponder. How does this deep, millennia-spanning collision of totally diverse civilizations continue to forge the complex, contradictory, and honestly beautiful multi-creedal American identity we share today? It's a living history, and we are all still writing the very next chapter. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, stay curious, and I'll catch you next time.